This lesson is about transitive passive verbs. We're going to do a little review first. Up to this point, we have been diagramming two different kinds of verbs. The first one is intransitive complete verbs, and the second one is transitive active verbs. So keep in mind, intransitive complete verbs are action verbs that do not transfer their action onto anything or anyone. Okay, so the way to remember that is intrans means not trans, right? So no transfer, does not transfer. Some examples are the dog barked, the baby laughed, the tree fell. In these three sentences, the verb barked or laughed or fell, those actions are complete and they do not transfer onto anything. Okay, that is in contrast to transitive active verbs. And transitive active verbs are action verbs that transfer their action to someone or something. It is the direct object that receives the action with these kinds of verbs. So here are some examples. I cleaned the kitchen. We watched the movie. Kicked the ball. So cleaned is the verb in the first sentence, and the kitchen is receiving the cleaning. The kitchen is a noun. The name of that noun is direct object, and it is receiving the action of the verb, the transitive active verb. In the second example, we watched the movie. Watched is the verb, movie is the noun doing the job of direct object, and it is receiving the action of being watched. And in the third example, kick is the verb, ball is the noun doing the job of direct object, and kick, the ball is receiving the kick. Okay, so in these types of verbs, transitive active verbs, you have a direct object that receives the action. In the first type of verb, intransitive complete, nothing, no one, and nothing is receiving the action. So there are actually 4 verb types, and in this lesson we're going to learn the third one. So here's a chart with the 3 of them. Here's the intransitive complete, no transfers. Here's the transitive active, transferring to the direct object. Our next verb that we're going to learn is called transitive passive. And in this case, this verb is going to transfer the action onto the subject. Yes, the new verb, transitive passive, transfers the action to the subject. So let's look at that more closely. Transitive passive verbs. Transitive passive verbs are action verbs that transfer their action to the subject. We say that these sentences are written in what's called the passive voice. So when you have sentences written with a transitive passive verb, they're called, you're writing in the passive voice. Transitive passive verbs always have a helping verb. So that can give you a hint. They always have helping verbs. Now, just because there's a helping verb doesn't mean it's transitive passive, but if it's transitive passive, it's going to have a helping verb. Here are some examples. Her car was wrecked. The class has been canceled. Steve's shin was kicked by Michelle. Okay, so let's take a close look at these. Who is doing the action in these sentences? In the first 2 examples, for example, the first one, her car was wrecked. We don't know who or what wrecked the car. We just know that it was wrecked, but we don't know who did it or what did it. Could have been a storm, could have been, somebody drove it into another car. Who knows? We don't know who or what caused the car to be wrecked. We just know that it was wrecked. So in the second one is the same. The class has been canceled. We don't know who canceled the class. We don't know what canceled the class. We just know that it has been canceled. So the doer of the action in these 2 first sentences is unknown. It's not written. The third example, we have the action was done by Michelle. The doer of the action is written in a prepositional phrase, by Michelle. Okay, so sometimes with transitive passive verbs, you have the doer of the action written in a prepositional phrase, but you do not have to know the doer of the action in a transitive passive verb. Okay, in transitive passive sentences, sometimes you'll know who the doer is from the prepositional phrase, but transitive passive verbs do not need to tell us who or what performed the action. Okay? because the action is being transferred onto the subject. The subject doesn't do the action in these sentences. The subject receives the action. Okay? Her car is the subject. That's what this sentence is about. It was wrecked. It's receiving being wrecked. It's not doing the wrecking, right? The car didn't wreck anything. It was wrecked. The class is the subject. It has been canceled. Now, it didn't cancel itself. Somebody canceled it or something canceled it. It is receiving the action of being canceled. Same with Steve's shin. The shin is the subject. It was kicked, right? So it is receiving the kick. This shin receives the kick. That's the action. And this noun shin here is the subject. Now, in this case, we know who kicked it. That was Michelle. You know, she's always kicking Steve for some reason. And so but we only know the doer because of the prepositional phrase. Okay, and notice that in each case they have helping verb. Was wrecked, has been canceled, was kicked. So transitive passive verbs will always have helping verbs. So let's talk about diagramming transitive passive verbs. Remember, the reason that we diagram sentences at all is to have a visual representation that shows how each part of the sentence works together. It is just to put the words in a diagram that shows how each is connected to the other, right? The funny thing about diagramming passive verbs is that they look in a diagram exactly the same as intransitive complete verbs. When you see a diagram, the passive verbs will look just like intransitive complete verbs, but it is important to remember that they actually have a very different job. They're grammatically related to the rest of the sentence very differently than the intransitive complete verbs because the action is being transferred to the subject. So here's an example. We're going to use Steve's shin was kicked by Michelle. We're going to start with our T like always. We're going to put our subject on the left-hand side of our vertical line, and we're going to put the verb was kicked on the right-hand side. That is no different than how we would diagram any sentence. Subject on the left, verb on the right. Okay, and then all of the rest of it diagrams the same too. Whose shin? Steve's shin. That's the adjective describing shin. By Michelle is a prepositional phrase describing was kicked, right? The only difference, this looks like a very familiar diagram, nothing that we haven't seen before, except the difference is, in this case, the subject is receiving the action. The shin was kicked, okay? Also, the doer of the action, instead of being the subject of the sentence, the doer of the action is now in the prepositional phrase, and the doer of the action is the object of the preposition. Okay, that is the difference between passive verbs and the other kinds of verbs that we have done up to now. This is a brand new kind of verb, and it is giving its action to the subject. So what I want you to do now is I want you to write in your notes this practice sentence and try to diagram it. The poor dog was bitten on its hind leg. We'll pause the video, practice, see if you can get that one, and then we'll put up the answer. Okay, here is the answer. Draw your T, subject and verb, dog was bitten, right? Adjective describing dog, the and poor, the dog, the poor dog, and on its hind leg tells you where it was bitten, and so we diagram that prepositional phrase. Again, these aren't super complicated as far as the way we diagram them. They're very similar to what we've done before. Difference being was bitten, the dog, the subject, is receiving that action. Okay? And we don't know who bit the dog. We don't know who the doer of this action of the biting. We don't know who. Did the baby bite the dog? Did another dog bite the dog? We don't know. Okay, so the doer is not always told in a transitive passive verb.